I'm going to start the semester with a story. Okay? So I want you to listen to the story. I want you to think about what the point of the story is. We're going to talk a little bit about the story. It's a familiar story, but it's a story that I'm going to tell again in a little bit different way. The story starts out like this. Check it out. There's this religious scholar, and he stood up to Jesus to entrap him. And he said, "Teacher, what do I need to do to inherit the kingdom of God? To inherit eternal life?" And Jesus was like, "Well, what does the law say? How do you interpret it?" And this religious scholar is like, "Well, two things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus is like, "Way to go! You answered correctly. Now go do it and you'll live." Well, the religious scholar is like, well, he wanted to justify himself, right? So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" So Jesus responds by telling a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, he said. And he fell upon some thugs who stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him for dead. Well, luckily, a priest was going down that road. And when he saw the man, he passed by the other side. But a Levite, he passed down that same road. And he saw the man. And he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, he was also going down that road. And when he came to that place, he saw the man. And when he saw the man, he had compassion on him. And he went to him. And he healed up his wounds, pouring wine and oil on him. And then he picked him up, and put him on his animal, and took him to an inn and cared for him. And the next day, he pulled out 2 $100 bills, and he gave them to the innkeeper. He said, "Here, take care of him. And when I return, if you've spent anything else on him, I'll reimburse you." Jesus looked at the religious scholar and said, "So, which of these 3 do you suppose became a neighbor to the man who got beat up by the thugs?" And the religious scholar replied, "The one who did mercy." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." So, that's the story. I try to retell the story in a way that emphasizes some of the unique aspects of what Jesus said. So that was my own translation, working from the Greek text, trying to kind of contemporize it a little bit with the two $100 bills and things like that. Check it out. That's actually literally what the story starts like this. There's a Greek word called idu, which the closest translation I can think of is check it out, or yo-yo, or something like that. I mean, that's just... But I want us to think about that story for a second, because I want us to think about this class as a kind of way of living out that story. The clicker is not working, so here's what I want to talk about. What stood out to you as you heard that story? What was being contrasted in that story, and then what do you think the point that Jesus is making in that story? I know it's awkward with masks, and part of this first day is just trying to figure out what can we do with this context that we have. I like to teach class by doing a lot of dialogue, and so I don't know if that's going to work. So let's try it. So what stood out to you when you heard that story? Yeah, John?
I'd say what stood out to me was how he was willing to pay a bill that he didn't know how high it would go. And it seemed to me that he was okay with the unknown. He was okay with paying a price that he didn't even know how high it would be. Yeah.
Good. Now I translated it as two $100 bills. The Greek word it was 2 denarii. Then 2 denarii equals something close to a day's wages. 1 denarii, sorry. So he's basically giving him two days' wages. But in terms of the economy of inns, if you will, there is a sense in which the guy basically the Samaritan gave the innkeeper somewhere upwards of 3 to 4 weeks worth of money to take care of this guy. It's a pretty huge sacrifice.
Think about staying in a hotel for 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What do you imagine hotels are like in the first century? Is there like Holiday Inn? What's a hotel like in the first century?
Somebody has a spare room.
Sorry, got it. It's a good thing we have hand sanitizer everywhere. Keep going. Think about this. What's a hotel like? Let me just frame it like this. What's a hotel like in a context and in an area of the world where hospitality is the most important value, and when you only go places where you know people? What can you imagine a hotel is like? Why would there be needs for hotels?
Foreigners, people who don't know anybody.
Yeah. What kind of reputation do hotels have in the first century? You think?
Pretty seedy.
It's not where you want. It's not where you'd ever want to stay. It's not really the most ideal place. What are innkeepers like in the first century? Not very trustworthy. You want to give $200 to an innkeeper? That's a risk. You don't know if you don't know how that money is going to be used. Most inns were also brothels. What else stood out to you as you were listening to that story?
I have a question then. So why didn't the Samaritan just take him to his own home instead of leaving him in a random inn?
Probably because he was going to die if he did go to his home. He's probably, from Jerusalem, if he's going to Jericho, it's a very long way, and it's in the road on the way to a desert. It's in the middle of a desert, and he probably would have died. So it was the best thing he could do. It was probably the only option he had. There's probably no other place to go. He's probably in the middle of 2 towns, and if he went that's where that's where inns are, because they're brothels, right? So he probably couldn't take him anywhere else, because if he did, the guy would have died. Yeah, Sam.
I just watched the Liam Neeson version of Les Mis the other day,
Hmm.
and in there it portrays Cosette's mom, this little girl who she had out of wedlock. She leaves her with this family, and the family starts making up these things about her being sick, and she needs this expensive medicine, and so they make up all of these things that she needs to pay for. And so they keep sending these very endearing letters about send more money for this and that and the other. And it just reminds me of that.
Yeah.
It goes on top of what Jonathan was saying. Not only do you not know what the bill was, but
Who knows what
Yeah.
the money's going to be used for, and yeah. Good. Think about. I want you to think about the question that was asked by the religious scholar. And I want you to think about the question that Jesus asked. How are they different? What's the question that the Samaritan asked?
Samaritan was like, who is my neighbor? And Jesus' question is, who became a neighbor? It's this idea of like, I think the religious scholar is like, who do I have to care for? And Jesus is like, no, it's not about who is your neighbor, but be a neighbor. I guess it's just very much more like, instead of sitting there being like, who are the people I need to love? Like, go out and love people.
Yeah.
It's a lot more like active versus passive.
Very good. Yes. And this is the key point of the story is the disposition of the two. The scholar rightly talks about the law. He says he sort of takes the Torah, and especially the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and he kind of boils it down, if you will, to the two main tenets. Love God, all your heart and soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbor. Jesus is like, yeah, that's good. That's good. The religious scholar's like, yeah, but wait a second here. How can I get out of some of this? Okay. Who is my neighbor? Where can I draw the lines so that I don't have to, go too far, How it's nice. The Spanish word for neighbor is prójimo, which also means the next to you one. You translate, and it's similar in most languages. Like the idea of neighbor, where we kind of think of a neighborhood, the idea of the word neighbor connotes someone who's near you, next to you, and so he's kind of playing on that idea. Okay, who is my neighbor? Like how far? 6 feet? Or does that have to go further? Yeah.
Sort of brings to mind when the disciples asked, how often should I forgive?
Yeah.
7 times.
Right. And it was more like 7 times? Like that was a lot. He's like, no, let's up it. Let's square it. Let's even more than square it. Yeah. No, yeah. So the issue that Jesus raises is not how can we define who our neighbor is. It's what can you do to become neighborly? Totally different thing, right? And it's really interesting in the Greek, a couple of things. I found myself kind of frustrated in some of the English translations because one translation said Jesus asked I think it was the ESV where it's translated who proved himself to be a neighbor to the man who fell amongst the robbers or something like that. But really the word used is who became a neighbor to that man. And there's a sense in which that what Jesus is saying is to love your neighbor is not to define who your neighbor is. To love your neighbor is to become neighborly. To see yourself as one who is always neighboring. Right? The other interesting thing that I think, as I was kind of looking at this text, was I tried to bring it out in the performance of the text. When Jesus says, who of these three do you think became a neighbor to the man that got mugged by these thugs? And the religious scholar answered, the one, now most English translations will say the one who had mercy. But that's a little weak, especially in English, because when you think about having mercy, it means, oh, we feel a certain way towards somebody. But the scholar says, no, the one who did mercy. It's a very different word. And in fact, it's tapping into the whole Old Testament tradition where mercy is not so much a feeling as it is an action. It's a thing you do. Mishpat, the word for justice or righteousness, tzedakah. That's not something you sort of conceptually think about. It's what you do. You do mercy. Anybody know Micah 6:8? What's that? Yeah, you got it.
Oh.
You got it.
Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your
Yeah.
God.
Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. Those are all doing things, right? So, the other thing is that I wanted us to see in this story, and by the way, this picture that was here is Van Gogh's. Some of you even got it. You say that looks like Van Gogh. It is. It's Van Gogh. This is Good Samaritan, right? He's putting him up on his animal, which most people thought it was probably a donkey. The other thing I think is really important is that the three people in the story, they all saw the man, right? The priest, it says, saw him, and he passed on by. The Levite says, saw him, and he passed on by. But the Samaritan saw him, says, and then he had compassion. And then the next line is, and he went to him. The contrast between seeing, passing by, right? Versus seeing, having compassion, and moving towards. Now, why did I want to start the class like this? Because in essence, this class is about learning to become a neighbor. Learning to become neighborly. It's ultimately about taking Bib Theo and Bib Lit and all the other things that you've been learning and thinking about how does all of this equip us to become neighborly, to be neighbors to others, to love God with all of our heart and with all of our soul and with all of our mind and with all of our strength by being neighbors. But this class is not just about learning how to do that at the micro individual level. Not just at the level of the Good Samaritan who's just happened to go being about his business, and lo and behold, he stumbles across a man who's been left for dead. As important as that is, that's what we call micro level. This class is more trying to get us to think at a macro level about what it means to become a neighbor. At a systemic level, at a at a theological level. How can we think more deeply about neighborliness and what it means to love God and to love our neighbor? So we will think personally, certainly, but we also need to think systemically. Systemically, maybe is a better word to think about it. Now, I know one of the weaknesses of evangelical Christianity, one of the weaknesses of the constituents of Laterno, is that we tend to think overly individualistically without recognizing systems and ways of life that are put in place that sort of put us in ruts and move us in certain directions. And so while we will focus on, we will challenge one another on the individualistic level, certainly and hopefully, we're also going to think a lot about systemically how can we become better neighbors. The other interesting little thing in the story was that Jesus mentioned two times in talking about the story that he said the Samaritan came to that place. It's an interesting like why add that phrase? When he came to that place where the man was, and then he says it with the Good Samaritan. When he came to that place where the man was. And I don't really actually know why Jesus emphasizes those words, but I will use it as a way of talking to us and reminding us that one of the things that we're going to think about as we think about being neighbors is place, the importance of place. Another thing that our most recent history of the last 100 years we have tended to not think very much about. We kind of consider place as a throwaway, a kind of irrelevancy to what we're really about in this world. But we're going to think afresh about a theology of place. How should we think about this place that God has called us in? How does place play a role in us thinking about our calling? We are not disembodied people. We are not just brains in a vat. We are embodied people who live in history and who live in a place. How does that shape the way that we think about our lives? So that's some of the things that we're going to be doing. So, in this class, we're going to be reflecting upon our calling or our vocation. Right? It's part of the core of the Honors College. It's also the core of our curriculum at Laterno. And we're going to be thinking about the biblical story and how that biblical story enables us to understand who God is, how we are to love Him, and how we are to best love our neighbor. And then we're going to think about how becoming neighborly is attached to the places in which we find ourselves. Okay? So that's just a way of kind of introducing why this class and what this class is about. Any questions or comments or thoughts before we move on to our next little